the death of classical civilization and the barbarian migrations that accompanied it left the shores of the Mediterranean Sea and an extensive hinterland behind them in cultural chaos. The area was filled with shattered social groups and cultural wreckage bobbing about on swirls and eddies as if a great ship had sunk in a quiet sea. In the next 300 years, 500 to 800, these peoples and cultural debris began to integrate to form core areas of 3 new civilizations. All of these were on the extreme periphery of the older classical society. To the southeast, in Arabia, AP, paired Islamic civilization. To the northeast, in the northern flatlands, appeared Orthodox Russian civilization, and in the northwest, in France, appeared Western civilization. Each of these had its distinctive outlook and organization, as all societies do, and the relationship between the 3 became one of the continuing problems of the next 1500 years. Western civilization presents one of the most difficult tasks for historical analysis, because it is not yet finished, because we are a part of it and lack perspective, and because it presents considerable variation from our pattern of historical change. The first 2 of these difficulties are valued enough. If Western civilization is still in its course, its future is not yet settled and its past is, accordingly, capable of diverse interpretations. Moreover, our own involvement in it handicaps our interpretation because many of its most significant features are so familiar to us that we accept them without statement or even recognition. The importance of these 2 difficulties will appear in our own analysis. Moreover, the analysis of Western civilization in terms of the 7 stages is difficult because it clearly does not follow the straightforward pattern of 7 simple stages. Of course, any student in any society has an inclination to regard his own culture as being in some way exceptional, but in this case, more than others, there seems to be objective justification for such a feeling. No culture has ever exceeded Western civilization in power and extent. Our society now covers more than half of the globe, extending in space from Poland in the east to Australia in the west. In the course of this expansion, most of it during the last 5 centuries, the power of Western civilization has been so great that it has destroyed, almost without thinking of it, hundreds of other societies, including 5 or 6 other civilizations. As we have already indicated, the history of Western civilization to the middle of the 20th century is not a simple story of rise and fall, but rather a series of at least 3 successive pulsating movements of expansion. Each period of expansion has been followed by an age of crisis, but in 2, and probably in all 3, of these crises the organization of expansion has been circumvented or reformed sufficiently to provide a new instrument of expansion, and accordingly a new period in stage 3. We have already given these 3 periods of expansion the rough dates 9701 to 1420 to 1650. And 1730 to 1929. Each of these ended in an age of conflict, Any such analysis as this is bound to lead to disagreement among students of the subject, and, as a consequence, it may be necessary to give in this chapter some references to scholarly research, something we have managed to avoid in the earlier chapters of this book. Although Western civilization emerged from the wreck age of classical antiquity, it differed from it in every important aspect of its culture. Even in its first three stages it had a different military system based on specialized cavalry rather than on infantry, a different technology based on animal power rather than on slavery, a different economic organization, a different political organization formed about rural castes rather than around municipal acropolises, and, above all, an entirely different religious system and basic ideology. The only level where a certain similarity between the two cultures could be found is on the social levels, where both civilizations began with a two-class society of fighting nobles and agricultural peasantry organized in self-sufficient economic units, genus and manner, and slowly changed, in both cases, by the insertion of a town-dwelling commercial middle class between the original two. We have already spoken of this similarity. The differences between the two societies on most levels of culture are either well known or will be explained in the present chapter. But the most important difference, that on the intellectual level, is too significant to be discussed in this cursory way. In any society, the non-material culture is the most significant feature of the whole society, because it is the least capable of being exported and because it is pervasive in all the other levels as well. In this particular case there is the additional necessity for exposition of this aspect, because of widespread ignorance or misunderstanding of it. We might begin by saying that Western ideology is optimistic, moderate, hierarchical, democratic, individualistic yet social, and dynamic. All these terms refer only to aspects of the whole and do not really get us to its essence. This essence might be summed up in the belief that truth unfolds in time through a communal process. Before we attempt to analyze this rather cryptic statement, we should say a few words about the more superficial aspects. The Western outlook is optimistic because it believes that the world is basically good and that the greatest good lies in the future. This covers all the ideas Haiti and Gilson included in the term Christian optimism. The classical ideology began by being mundane and ended with a dualism in which it saw the universe as an evil material world opposed to a good spiritual sphere. Western ideology believes that the material is good and the spiritual is better, but that they are not opposed to each other, since the material world is necessary for the achievement of the spiritual world. The world and the flesh are good because they were both made by God, as in the Old Testament. The material world is necessary to the spiritual in two ways. 1. No soul exists without a body, and 2. No soul can be saved except by its own efforts and cooperative actions with other persons, both of which can be achieved only by bodily actions in this world. These ideas appeared clearly in the Christian religion. although they had a very difficult time getting accepted because the dualistic late classical ideology regarded the world and the flesh as evil and felt that the spirit could achieve full spirituality only by freeing itself from the body, from the world, and from contact with one's fellow man, and that such spiritual achievement was a consequence of the individual's own activity alone, without cooperation with his fellow men. This attitude appeared very clearly in Persian thinking about 600 BC, came into classical antiquity through the Pythagorean rationalists, and was given the clear, explicit, and influential statement in Plato's Phaedo about 385 BC. Although quite incompatible with the classical outlook, these ideas became increasingly influential and became the generally accepted philosophic outlook after the 3rd century of our era. This led to a phenomenal outgrowth of anchoritism in the 3rd to 6th centuries. It must be recognized that this philosophic position was basically incompatible with the religious ideas of Christianity. The latter has been threatened ever since by dualistic heresies like Arianism, capitalism, or Jansenism derived from this philosophic background. Western ideology believed that the world was good because it was made by God in 6 days, and that at the end of each day he looked at his work and said that it was good. This meant that the world was a comprehensible place, one of the basic ideas of Western science, and that its existence unfolded in time, not by instantaneous creation or through eternal existence. The body was also good, being made by God in his own image. Man needed others in order to develop his capacities in time, and he needed his body, his fellow men, and God's help, as well as his own efforts to achieve, over time, salvation in the future. This salvation included the body as well as the soul, resurrection of the body and life everlasting, and could be achieved by good works requiring the body and one's fellow men and God's grace granted by God himself taking the human body and living in time in this world. All of these things were clearly stated in the New Testament, and the objections to them arising from classical dualism were firmly rejected at the First Church Council held at Nicaea in 325. The full implications of the injunction to love thy neighbor were not completely unfolded in these 2 steps, but continue to be so through the present and into the future. While the aristocratic classical culture had put the golden age in the past, more democratic Western culture put it and salvation in the future. This optimistic and hopeful attitude applied to most aspects of Western life. Its hierarchical aspect appeared originally in the belief that the spiritual rested on the material, not opposed to it, and also came to apply to much of life. This led to a basic distinction now largely lost between necessary and important, in which material things were necessary but spiritual things were important. The democratic and individualistic aspects of the Western outlook were always present, and go back, like other aspects, to the New Testament. They rest on the belief that all men have souls fit for salvation and, in the long run, have equal opportunity to achieve salvation. These ideas also appear in Christ's concern with the downtrodden and oppressed, in the belief that the first and greatest sin was pride, the sin of Lucifer, and that the greatest virtue was humility. In the Beatitudes and in many parables such as that of the lost sheep. It is worthy of note that all these points are concerned not only with the individual's relationship to himself and to God, but also with his relationship to his fellow men. All these, along with the emphasis on good works and the importance of sacraments, show the significance of the social element in Western thought. The same significance was underlined in the idea that man can be fully man and fully please God only in society. This idea was reflected in religion in the idea of the Church. The Societas perfected the belief that salvation could be obtained most readily through the Church. The idea of the sacraments, all of which require the presence of at least two persons and most of which require three. The efforts, in the 6th century, to replace anchorites with monks, that is, to replace a late classical aberration with a system more compatible with Western sociality. All these different aspects of the Western outlook cluster about the essence of the outlook that we have tried to express in the statement that truth unfolds through a communal process. The outlook to which this statement refers lies at the foundation of Western culture and is reflected equally in its religion, its politics, its science, and its economics. This outlook assumes, first, that there is a truth or goal for man's activity. Thus it rejects despair, solipsism, skepticism, pessimism, and chaos. It implies hope, order, and the existence of a meaningful objective external reality. And it provides the basis for science, religion, and social action as the West has known these. Second, this attitude assumes that no one, now, has the truth in any complete or even adequate way. It must be sought or struggled for. Thus this outlook rejects smugness, complacency, pride, and personal authority in favor of the Christian virtues and kind of basic agnosticism, with the implication we don't yet know everything, as well as the idea of achievement of good through struggle to reach the good. The earliest great work of German literature, Partival, has as its subtitle "The Brave Man Slowly Wise." This is typical of the Western ideology's belief that wisdom for any real achievement comes as a consequence of personal effort in time. The same idea is to be found in Dante's Divine Comedy, in Shakespeare's tragedies taken as a whole, and in Beethoven's symphonies. There are two important ideas here. One is that no one has the whole truth now, but that it can be approached closer and closer in the future, by vigorous effort. And the other is that no single individual does this or achieves this, but that it must be achieved by a communal effort, by a kind of cooperation in competition in which each individual's efforts help to correct the errors of others and thus help the development of a consensus that is closer to the truth than the actions of any single individual ever could be. We might call these two aspects the temporal and the social. They are covered in our maxim by the words unfolds and social. There is also a third idea here, namely, that the resulting consensus is still not final, although far superior to any earlier or more individual version. Thus the advance of mankind or of any single individual is an endless process in which truth or any achievement, even the development of an individual's personality, is constantly approached closer and closer without ever being finished or reached. We might mention also another phase of this outlook, namely, the idea that the cooperative effort that unfolds truth through a continuously developing consensus is a competitive process. More accurately, it is cooperation through competition, as a game is. This refers to a social process that is superficially competitive but fundamentally cooperative. Or, viewed in another way, the situation in which individuals compete and even struggle together for a higher social end, the consensus. This is a dialectic process and is one of the heritages from classical antiquity, where this idea of the emergence of truth from pluralistic debate in the marketplace is found in the earlier dialogues of Plato and of other thinkers. It is worthy of note that Plato, while retaining the form of the dialogue, really abandoned its function in his later writings, The Republic and those following, by using Socrates as the spokesman of his own ideas that contain the whole truth, while the other speakers contribute nothing to the final achievement, since their ideas are erroneous and must be corrected by Socrates. This idea of the fruitful debate from which truth grows is the basis for the method of medieval intellectual advance, in spite of the erroneous theory so widely accepted that medieval ideas were rigid systems imposed by authority. This conception is of course found behind medieval exposition, as in Abelard's Sic et Nam or Aquinas's Summa Theologica, but it is much more fully realized in the process by which medieval ideas were reached than in the form in which they were presented. However, in both there was a fundamental assumption that each presentation was temporary and not fully perfect, and was subject to improvement in a later revision as a consequence of criticism. The idea, so widely spread today, that the Summa Theologica was a final, complete, and permanent presentation of its subject, was not held at the time by anyone, least of all by Aquinas himself. After all, the angelic doctor offered the world at least 3 versions of this subject: the Summa contra Gentiles, the Summa Theologica, and the incomplete but really much improved Compendium Theology. This attitude, to which I have referred by the maxim about the social unfolding of truth, is the basis of the Western religious outlook. This outlook believed that religious truth unfolded in time and is not yet complete. The Old Testament, for example, was not cancelled or replaced by the New Testament but was supplemented by it. And the New Testament was never, in most of the life of Western civilization, regarded as a literal, explicit, and final statement of the truth. Rather, recognition of its truths have to be developed in time, by social action, from basically symbolic statements. Thus the doctrine of the Christian Church was unfolded through church councils like that at Nicaea and by census of learned doctors and clerics, without ever any feeling that the process was finished. The fundamentalist position on biblical interpretation, with its emphasis on the explicit, complete, final, and authoritarian nature of Scripture, is a very late, minority view quite out of step with the Western tradition. Closely related to this idea of the unfolding of doctrine through the Church is the idea of the development of the individual, both in life and in death, toward the beatific vision. The same idea about the social and dialectic unfolding of truth is at the foundation of Western science. It assumes that science is never static or fully achieved, but pursues a constantly receding goal to which we approach closer and closer from the competition cooperation of individual scientists, each of whom offers his experiments and theories to be critically re-examined and debated by his fellow scientists in a joint effort to reach the higher and temporary consensus. The same outlook appears in the basic political ideas of the West. These are liberal and not authoritarian. They cannot be authoritarian because no individual or institution has full and final truth. Instead, a fuller and more complete truth emerges as a guide to social activity from the free debate in free assembly of all men's partial truths. Thus liberalism in this sense is basic in the outlook of the West and goes back, as we indicated earlier, to the dissociation of state and society in the Dark Ages when the former vanished and the latter continued. In its narrowest version, this idea appeared as the theory that all men with different outlooks or contributions cooperate together to form something greater than the partial opinions of any of them. This kind of pluralism is assumed by the polycratic hopes of John of Salisbury in the 12th century as much as it is assumed by the United States Constitution in the 18th century. The same kind of pluralist outlook is the real justification of capitalism and of all laissez-faire or pluralist economic systems so typical of the West even in its early period when economic development was taking its first steps. It is the outlook behind the 19th century community of empirists that has been exposed to such critical onslaughts in the 20th century but yet remains as the unstated assumption behind our economic attitudes as they operate in actions. Thus we see the basic ideology of the West reflected in all aspects of the society, and continuing to influence ideas and actions even after it has been explicitly rejected. It is, for example, behind the theories of such late and unconventional thinkers as Darwin or Marx, both of whom believed that the better emerged from the good by the superficial struggles of the many to achieve what could never have been reached by any single individual alone. In fact, of these two, Marx's dialectic materialism is rather closer to the Western tradition than Darwin's struggle for existence. Silent Marx, like his mentor Hegel, was Western in his belief that progress is achieved through struggle, but, like Hegel, he committed the Western sin of pride, the sin of Lucifer in the intellectual arrogance which expected achievement of a final goal in the material world and in the near future. Part of the difficulty to be found in analysis of the history of Western civilization arises from the vicissitudes of the Western tradition. These difficulties were present throughout Western history. In the early period, say up to 1150, the difficulty arose from the fact that the religious outlook and practices of our society were incompatible with the intellectual outlook and philosophy derived from the dualistic ideas of the Platonic and Neoplatonic tradition. Thus, in a figure like Augustine, we find the Christian religious outlook combined with the Platonic philosophic outlook with which it is really not compatible. One consequence of this situation was a great prevalence of dualistic heresies. These were condemned as part of the religious settlement at Nicaea in 325. But they were not really overcome in philosophy until the 12th century. At this latter time, the triumph of moderate realism, as represented by Abelard, Albertus Magnus, or Thomas Aquinas, over-exaggerated realism, as represented by Saint Anselm or William of Champeaux, represented the achievement, within Christian society, of a philosophy that was compatible with its religious outlook. The official acceptance by the papacy in the early 14th century of Thomism, in spite of the attacks of the exaggerated realists, sealed this victory. Such a victory, in accordance with the tradition of the West, was not the victory of one extreme view over another, but rather the moderate synthesis of the extremes in a higher unity. Thus the exaggerated realist extremists said that the universal was real and that the individual was an illusion, the position totally incompatible with Christianity and therefore never held, in this extreme form, by any Orthodox Christian. At the other end of the spectrum, the nominalists said that the individual was real and that the universal was only a word or a subjective concept. The Thomistic compromise, which was compatible with Christianity and the Western tradition, said that both the individual and the universal were real. This thesis disrupted very soon into two extremist positions, represented in philosophy by Scotus realism and Academite nominalism. The same scission into two extremes was found in religion during the late Middle Ages between these who advocated salvation through good works like Saint Francis of Assisi and Thomas à Kempis, and those who advocated salvation through God's grace, the new ascetics, mystics, and ultimately the Protestants, each group tending to place such emphasis on its own path to salvation as almost to deny the other extreme. Or again, within the Church appeared a split between those who emphasized it as a temporal organization and thus corrupted it, and those who emphasized it as a spiritual group, and thus, like Savonarola, Huss, and Luther, tended to deny its organization. From this it can be seen that the ideology of the Christian West was essentially a moderate one. It was constantly threatened, as moderates always are, by extremism. When these extremists argued for either or, the Western tradition answered both. But this answer was no sooner given than new appeals by extremists sought to reopen the debate, to destroy the moderates, and to disrupt the synthesis. The extremists from one side, the left, if you will, based their appeals on individualism, the senses, and materialism, and thus on the Christian insistence on the need of the world and the body. The extremists from the other side, the right, we might say, based their appeal on society, rationalism, and spirituality, and thus on the Christian emphasis on the soul, God's grace, and the perfect rationality of God. Ultimately, in the history of ideas, the former extreme goes back to the Hebrews and to the Ionian atomists, while the latter extreme goes back to Persian Zoroastrianism and to the Pythagorean rationalists. Above all, to Plato. Within Western religious history and the history of the Church, which is both temporal and spiritual, these two extremes have been represented by corruption and by dualistic heresy. It is easy for us to see how corruption, that is, too great emphasis on the material and temporal aspect, destroys religion, but it is not so easy for many to see how too great spirituality, that is, too great emphasis on the non-material and eternal aspect, can destroy religion. This condition arises because religion is a linking from liberate, to join together, as in English ligament or ligature of the two extremes, man and God, that cannot exist if either extremity is absent. In the history of Western non-material culture, including religion and philosophy, the threat to the synthesized motor, a middle ground from the right, has come from dualistic rationalism and especially from the influence of Plato. This influence has worked historically through Augustine of Hippo, who was a Platonist in philosophy although a Christian in religion. In the field of religion itself, this influence has given rise to dualistic heresies, of which the chief, as might be expected, have appealed to Augustine. Augustine himself was not a heretic. He said, "Man is saved by God's grace," but he never said, "Man is saved by God's grace alone." Since the orthodox position, the middle ground was that man was saved by God's grace and his own good works among his fellow men, Augustine's statement was incomplete but not wrong, that is heretical. Only when this partial statement was accepted as a whole, complete, and final statement did it become heresy. But the tendency for the rightist extremists to do this was very strong, and this tendency was most irresistible among those who were closest to the Augustinian tradition. Thus Luther, who was an Augustinian monk, did believe in salvation by grace alone, and the last great heresy from the spiritual extremists was Jansenism, which grew out of Jansen's book The Augustine Muse, a study of Augustine's theology 1632. This spread through figures like Pascal and the Port Royal group and was condemned as a heresy by the papacy in the bull Unigenitus in 1715. Of course, the threat to the Western ideology based on synthetic moderation came equally, if not more, easily from the left, from the materialists and nominalists. but this is a well-known story that needs to be mentioned here only because the loss of the ideology of Western civilization, like the earlier loss of the ideology of classical civilization, will rest rather on the overemphasis on materialism and selfish individualism than it will on overemphasis of rationalism or spirituality. In most civilizations, as we have already shown, there is a strong tendency for the basic ideology of the society to become lost and misunderstood during the age of conflict and to be abandoned totally in the age of decay. Since Western civilization has gone into an age of conflict 3 times, the threat to the society's ideology has been practically endemic. Anyone who wishes to recover this ideology can do so by reflecting on the word moderation for the expression reconciliation with extremes, or, more abstrusely, on our maxim about the unfolding of truth through social activity over time. When our old professor said of Goethe that he was conciliatory, he was saying that he was a figure in the Western tradition. But when we say that Hitler was an extremist or a fanatic, we are equally clearly excluding Hitler from the real Western tradition. The mixture of cultural elements that formed Western society came from 4 chief sources. One of these was classical culture, whose greatest influence was in law, government, philosophy, and science. Another was the Semitic influence, which came largely through Christianity and the Jewish people and thus spread its effects largely in the field of religion and morality. The third influence, that of the barbarians, was a very diffused one, and is chiefly notable in social relations and technology, while the last, coming from the Saracens, consists mostly in incidental items and served also as an intermediary in the transfer of classical influences. The creation of the new society was a lengthy and painful process in which the most vital changes occurred at opposite ends of the cultural spectrum in the areas of military technology and of religion. The religious influence, which we have already mentioned, served to divorce people's allegiance from classical culture and to focus it on a new ideology for which men were willing to sacrifice their wealth, leisure, and safety. The military influence sprang from the need to find a method by which Christian groups could be defended from the onslaughts of pagan invaders. The Christian society could arise and maintain itself only if its members could be defended against non-Christian intruders. The older, classical military tactics had been based on infantry, fighting in compact masses and highly disciplined so that they could not be broken under enemy attack but rather would remain in alignment and position so that each individual could be at least partly covered by the shield and sword of his neighbor. This infantry technique, which had undergone only slight modifications in the long period from the Greek hoplites and Macedonian phalanxes to Roman legions, had become completely obsolete in the 4th century of our era before the impact of charging horsemen. The threat from these horsemen rested not only on their possession of mounts but also on the fact that these horses could be used day after day without resting because hoof wear was prevented by iron horseshoes, and the impact of their lances on standing men was greatly increased by the Use of stirrups. We do not know exactly when horseshoes and stirrups were introduced into the West, but it is certain that they were invented fairly early in the Christian period in the northern flatlands of Asia, probably by one of the Altaic-speaking peoples, and were introduced into Europe during the period of barbarian migrations. It is possible that the Huns had these innovations as early as the 4th century, and this may well explain the horrors these people evoked in the West. One of the chief reasons for the widespread fear of the Huns rested on their ability to travel very long distances in relatively short periods. This ability may well have been based on their use of horseshoes. The new military tactic of mounted men fighting in loose groups armed with lances or spears required so much skill and training that fighting men had to be specialists, free to practice because they were supported economically by others. This requirement made it inevitable that the new Christian society must be a two-class society divided into those who fought from horseback and those who produced the food to support all persons and their animals. The fighting man in this organization was very expensive because his horses he needed at least to his arms, and his leisure to practice fighting were expensive. This meant that the ratio, in the society, between soil tillers and fighters would be high, something in the order of 100 to 1. The specialized fighters and the specialized toil tillers in this organization were very unequal in power, although, perhaps, not so overwhelmingly unequal as we might guess. When the organization reached its full development in the late 11th century, the knight provided all the protection and the peasant, by then usually a serf, provided all the food. The knight needed food as much as the peasant needed protection, but the time ratio between these needs was to the advantage of the knight to such an extent that he could use his power against the peasant in the short run to enforce obedience so long as he did not injure the peasant's capacity to produce food in the long run. This power ratio of knight and serf was so great that it was possible for knights to force serfs to contribute to their support beyond the amount necessary for the expenses of protection alone. Accordingly, there was a flow of the economic necessities produced by the serfs into the possession of the knights. Thus the medieval knight became a surplus-creating instrument as well as an instrument of defense, a political power, and the upper class in the social system. This complex organization on the military, political, social, and economic levels is called feudalism. It was supported by an economic organization of self-sufficient agricultural units called manors, and acted as the surplus-creating organization of the instrument of expansion of Western civilization in its first 4 stages. The whole system was supported by the economic production of the peasant. This latter relationship was so vital for the existence of the system that the peasant was legally forbidden to leave his position on the land and thus became a serf. On the whole, the peasant did not resist serfdom, since it gave him a secure status that provided protection and justice. The period of mixture of Western civilization was merely a continuation of the period of invasion of classical civilization, and lasted from about AD 370 to at least 750. It was followed by a period of gestation of about 200 years. The two periods together had to achieve three tasks. First, to bring into existence the new Christian society by creating relationships between groups and individuals and by establishing patterns of ideas and activity that would permit a new society to survive. Second, to repel invasions of non-Christian cultures or to enforce conformity to the new Christian patterns by those who could not be expelled. And third, the accumulation and investment functions of the instrument of expansion must begin to operate. These three tasks were achieved in the order in which we have listed them: the first in the period of mixture, the third in the period of gestation, and the second bridging over both periods. This second was such a gigantic task that it delayed the achievement of the third task and led the society into political ambitions that could not possibly be supported by the economic base available. These ambitions took the form of the Carolingian Empire, whose brief life covered the generation before 814. The task of repelling invaders from Christian society was extraordinarily successful. To us today it is still a puzzle as to how it was achieved. As late as 732 the Saracen invaders were only 50 miles from Paris, but as early as 1099 the Christian counterattack on the Saracens had captured Jerusalem. During most of this interval the attacks on the west continued, by Vikings and Northmen in the Baltic and North Sea areas, by pagan Germans and Turkic peoples from the east, and by the Saracens in the Mediterranean area. In one way or another, these peoples were pushed back or were adopted into Western society. The success of these military achievements, especially by the Carolingians, led to their abortive effort to re-establish in Europe a recreated universal Roman Empire. This was an overextension of military and political ambitions quite unwarranted by the social and economic conditions. In terms of our analysis, it meant that surpluses being accumulated by the political and military organizations were being expended in the same levels in an effort to expand on these levels more rapidly than the economic basis would allow. Before any centralized political system such as Carroll could function steadily, it was necessary to achieve a very great expansion and intensification of the economic level by diverting the surpluses being accumulated on the political and military levels into the economic level. The real difficulties on the political and military levels that made the Carolingian effort fail were in respect to three phenomena: 1. Poor transportation, 2. Poor communications, and 3. The superiority of defensive weapons. We have already mentioned that the old Roman Empire was supported on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea by the superiority of sea transportation over land transportation, thus binding the shores of the sea to each other more closely than any shore was bound to its own hinterland. The creation of a universal Carolingian empire would have needed a system of land transportation able to bind Europe into a unified whole. No such system existed or could exist in the year 800. Roads were almost totally lacking, and could not be supported in any adequate fashion by the limited output of the economic system. At that time Europe was just obtaining from the East an adequate method of harnessing, including the horse collar and traces, but this method was not yet widely known, and the economic system was not able to support any large number of horses or men devoted to transportation. Closely related to the lack of transportation was the inadequacy of communications, including that basic item, the level of literacy. Literacy has been associated historically with the existence either of a priestly group seeking to keep records or of a commercial group seeking to communicate over a distance as well as to keep records. The transportation inadequacy that led to self-sufficient manners and the political disorder that gave a low level of personal security combined to make commerce almost impossible in the early medieval period. Without a commercial group, literacy thus was a monopoly of the clergy. But even here poverty and disorder led to a high degree of localism and a decrease in communication and in literacy. Without these things no centralized government could possibly function, and the Carolingian effort to establish one proved abortive. It is worthy of note that the subsequent revival of government, after the 10th century, followed very closely the revival of literacy among the clergy and a new commercial class, and that rulers made use of these two groups in sequence to count their monies and handle their communications and accounts. The third factor in the disappearance of centralized government was the superiority of defensive weapons. For any government to function, it must be able to know what is happening at a distance, to communicate its orders, and to enforce obedience to these. The enforcement of obedience to orders cannot go further than the limit of the superiority of offensive power over defensive power. In the year 8900 there was no such superiority. On the contrary, the defense was superior over the offensive to a degree that has never been exceeded in the historic period, even during its nearest analogy, the Mediterranean world about 1000 BC. The military system of Europe about AD 1000 is of extraordinary interest because it was built about two supreme weapons, neither of which could defeat the other. These were the mounted knight and the castle. Quite obviously, a castle could not defeat the knight. And, almost equally obviously, a knight could not defeat a castle. The only way that a knight or group of knights could defeat a castle was by siege. But this was extremely difficult during the early Middle Ages because of the technical difficulty of supplying a besieging force at a distance so that it could starve out the defenders before it starved itself from exhaustion of supplies. Any besieging force had to be stronger than the besieged, or it would be driven from the area and the siege broken. But to maintain a superior besieging force placed an almost impossible burden on the available transport. The besiegers could start out the besieged only if they could supply a larger force at a distance than the besieged had available in their own stores. This was such an unlikely possibility for much of the Middle Ages that a castle remained as a supreme defensive weapon for most of that period. Politically, this means that anyone who had a castle could say no to any order and could not be forced to submit. This means that every such castle became a nucleus of political independence, and since there were thousands of such castles in Europe, about 1,000, it meant that Europe was divided into thousands of independent political units, and that centralized political power over any extended area was impossible. In this situation, the clash of knight against knight was much less significant, for a knight, even when defeated on the field, could not be made to obey if he could retire into his castle. The defensive superiority of the castle inhibited the growth of larger political units longer than the inadequacy of transportation might warrant because of the intrusion of other factors. One of these delaying factors is to be found in the organization of feudalism itself. Feudal relationships sought to organize over larger areas by subinfeudation. By this process a lord would be owed military service and advice auxilium et consilium from a large number of vassals, each supported by an economic unit fief organized in manners. Efforts to organize these relationships into larger and larger systems led to problems that students of organization call problems of span. If, for example, the King of France had the right to expect 5,000 knights to answer his summons to military service, he would face an insoluble problem of span if he had to send out 5,000 individual summonses because he had 5,000 separate individual vassals. To avoid this, the lord reduced the number of his direct vassals to a manageable span by requiring numerous knights' services from each vassal. Thus the King of France could still summon 5,000 fighting men to service if he had 50 vassals, each of whom owed 100 fighting men services, or if he divided up the 5,000 into any two factors whose product would provide 5,000 men. The vassals who owed plural service could obtain the necessary fighting men by subinfeudating the fiefs that supported these fighters to their own vassals, or through them to their vassals' vassals. As these relationships became established, each vassal sought to specify what he owed his lord, and thus there gradually arose customary limits on the military service a lord could demand from his vassals. In many areas these limits came to be understood as no more than 40 days military service each year and at no greater distance than 2 or 3 days' ride 40 to 50 miles from the vassal's residence. These limits made it impossible to besiege a castle successfully within the limits, and this served to extend the defensive invulnerability of a castle against feudal forces even after the period when the inadequacy of transportation had hampered sieges. The interplay of these influences, and others not yet mentioned, were such as to create 3 sub-periods in the history of castle defense and thus in the history of political development. The first period, when transportation inequality was the chief factor, is the period of political feudalism. This political period continued until the late 11th century because of the importance of limitations on a vassal's military service in feudal customary law. Eventually feudal knights began to be replaced by similar fighters exerve, king for pay rather than for feudal obligation. These mercenary men-at-arms as they are called served as long as they were paid, and thus could capture a castle by siege simply by starving it out if transport of supplies was adequate. Since all possessors of castles did not have sufficient economic resources to obtain mercenary men-at-arms, those who did could besiege those who did not and force obedience upon the latter. This led to a reduction in the number of independent political units because it reduced the number who could refuse obedience to orders. Thus the number of political units in Europe became less, and the areas over which their orders could be enforced or over which their writ ran, as the saying went, became larger. This led to a second stage in the development of European political organization, known as feudal monarchy. The number of political units in Europe was reduced from thousands to hundreds. The next step forward in the development of the political level reduced the number of European political units from hundreds to scores and gave us a new stage in political development to which we apply the name Dynastic Monarchy. The military factor that contributed to its growth was the rise of artillery that made the private stone castle obsolete, since guns could shatter the walls of a castle and thus force its owner to submit. Artillery first appeared about 1325, but its effects were not clearly evident for 200 years. Then they became so clear that when a great lord wanted a residence after 1530 he built a palace rather than a castle. In this way, at the price of political submission to the royal artillery, the lord obtained an indefensible, but much more comfortable, residence at a lower cost. The number of lords with the financial and economic resources to obtain artillery was, of course, much less than the number who had mercenary men-at-arms, so that the former could enforce obedience from the latter. Political units became fewer in number and larger in area. The possession of artillery became the dividing line between public authority and private power, and later between possession of castles and the lack, as well as between the possession of the royal title and its lack. All these served to demark the period of dynastic monarchy in the political level at the rough date 1500. This period of dynastic monarchy 1500 to 1800 and even the preceding period of feudal monarchy 1100 to 1500 are, of course, subsequent to the age of gestation of Western civilization. But this examination of the factors necessary for the rise of these later stages of political development will show the futility of the Carolingian effort to create the revived universal monarchy at a time when even the earliest of these factors, transportation, was still in retreat. As long as transportation was lacking and political disorder continued, the age of gestation continued. The deep ambience of political and military life made it almost impossible for the feudal organization to amass surpluses and to direct these surpluses into expansive channels. Only in the final quarter of the 10th century was this situation reversed, and a new period of expansion, the first in Western civilization, began. The first stage of expansion in Western civilization lasted for about 3 centuries, 970 to 1270, and was one of the greatest of such periods in human history. Its instrument of expansion was the feudal system, in which a small minority of fighting men and clergy were supported by a great majority of peasants. The contributions of the latter to the former were far greater than the costs of protection and justice they received in return, so that surpluses accumulated in the possession of the upper class. At first these surpluses were used for political ends, to build castles or to rebuild older timbered fortifications in stone. But soon investment in economic activities began. This appeared either in agriculture or in the encouragement of long-distance commerce in luxury goods. The agricultural expansion was extensive, and took the form of establishing manors in unfilled areas by clearing wastelands or forests, or by draining swamplands. When this was done by secular lords, the new manors were generally similar to the older manors of the self-sufficient, balanced three-field type. But increasingly the manors spread by clerical, above all by monastic, groups were of a new type, producing still the basic needs of their own inhabitants, but adding to this an increasing surplus output of some product for sale off the manor. In grassy or hilly areas, these surplus products from new manors were likely to be wool, wines, or dairy products, chiefly cheeses, but in ordinary terrain it might be grain. The accumulation of surplus in the hands of the lords spiritual and temporal also created a demand for remote luxury goods derived from commerce. From the eastern forests opened by the Ions there came, by way of the Baltic, various forest products such as furs, honey, wax, and later hemp, tar, and even lumber. From Levant there came across the Mediterranean more exotic products, including fine textiles, fine metal products, spices, and dyes. Even, two links between these two great sea routes were established, the earliest being the Russian River route, then from Italy across the Brenner to Innsbruck, Nuremberg, and the North German rivers, or across the western Alpine passes to the Rhone, Champagne, and the northwestern rivers to the Low Countries. In the first part of the 14th century, an all-sea link was opened by way of the Strait of Gibraltar and Bay of Biscay to the narrow seas. The revival of commerce, especially in the 12th century, gave rise to a new social class isolated from the agricultural process, and living in towns rather than on manors. This new middle class, or bourgeoisie, created such a demand for the necessities of life that a new kind of commerce, of local origin and concerned with necessities, appeared. These three innovations, commerce, the middle classes, and town life, represented a social and economic revolution in Western society. They led to increased literacy, support for the revival of public authority, new ideas, new morality, and acute religious problems. Taken together, these provide a fairly typical example of Stage 3 in a civilization. The usual characteristics of Stage 3 are easy to identify in the period 1270 to 1300, increased production, growing population, geographic expansion, and increased knowledge. To a lesser degree, and somewhat belated, can be seen the growth of science, but democratic elements, while present, were unable to develop far because of the continued supremacy of specialized weapons. These kept power southeast, purely in the hands of the minority. The old view of our grandfathers that the Middle Ages was a static and backward era is now accepted by almost no one, but it is not so generally recognized that medieval expansion was slowing down by the end of the 13th century and that the society was entering upon a typical age of conflict. The 300 years of expansion that were drawing to a close as Aquinas died in 1274 had been financed by the demand of the upper classes for luxury goods of distant origin. In time this demand was reinforced and extended by the demands of the successful commercial groups for both luxuries and necessities. But by 1274 the feudal organization, especially the feudal lords, had become institutionalized into an obsolescent structure with few functions and a powerful determination to resist further change and to defend its own social position. This institutionalized feudalism is called chivalry. As a military system it was being replaced by royal and ducal forces based on mercenary men-at-arms. As a political influence it was being replaced by royal and princely rulers served by clerical or even bourgeois officials. These latter had, for the prince, the great advantage that they could count, keep records, and were literate, and yet had no independent military power of their own. Even as a social group, the feudal nobility were being challenged by persons of other origins, such as royal officials, clerical leaders, and wealthy bourgeoisie. The nobility had no desire to continue the process of change that had brought them to this situation, but they were in no position to stop continued development. One of the chief consequences of these economic changes was the advent of the money economy. As a result of this, all relationships in society developed a tendency to become expressed in monetary terms. This was true of the relationships that each noble lord had with his vassals in the feudal system and with his serfs in the manorial system. The aid and counsel owed by the vassal in the former case, as well as the dues and services owed by the serf in the latter, were, sooner or later, transformed from obligations to pay in kind to obligations to pay in money. Each change was made at the going rate of value, so that the nobles ceased to have fixed incomes in kind and began to have fixed incomes in money. But the steady rise in prices up to 1300 meant that the value of fixed money incomes was steadily reduced. Every year a fixed income would buy less. This rise in prices and equivalent fall in the value of money occurred because both the amount of money in circulation and the speed with which it circulated increased faster than the increase in the volume of goods available, although this was also increasing. The reduction of noble incomes by the decreasing value of money meant that less could be saved from these incomes. Thus there was less and less available for investment. If we consider that the price level was about 3 times as high in 1300 as it had been at the end of the 10th century, we shall see that a noble who commuted his income into money at the earlier date would have only 1/3 as much real income. At the later date, no one, of course, was quite this badly off, for the simple reason that no one commuted as early as the 10th century, and the later the commutation the less the loss. But by the end of the 13th century most nobles were being reduced to desperation. This situation was made even worse by the fact that the institutionalization of the nobility led to customary and legal restrictions on their activities that made it very difficult for them to supplement their decreasing real incomes. On the continent generally but not in England they were forbidden to engage in commerce or to marry non-noble girls. These restrictions made it impossible for the nobility to obtain access to incomes from the commercial class as was done in England, where there were a peerage and an aristocracy but no nobility. The result of all these noble misfortunes was that the only feasible way in which a noble could supplement his income was as a mercenary soldier or, possibly, as a royal bureaucrat. The latter was unlikely because writing and counting were not noble skills. Thus the noble was inclined to seek to supplement his income from war. This need became the basis for the imperialist wars of the Age of Conflict that began at the end of the 13th century. English wars against the Scots, Welsh, Irish, and French wars with the English, Burgundians, and others, the almost endless struggles among the princes, both lay and clerical, of Italy and Germany. All these, as well as civil struggles such as the Wars of the Roses, the struggles of the Armagnacs, or the Sicilian Vespers, helped to provide jobs for the impoverished feudal nobility. The economic crisis that emerged from the decrease of feudal spending was delayed only briefly by the continuance of saving and investment by commercial groups. The economic life of the towns, including both commercial and crop activities, became institutionalized in the 14th century largely by the activities of the guilds. As demand ceased to grow, these adopted restrictive regulations, preventing admission of new workers to most activities and, under the pretext of protecting the quality of the products, curtailed output and increased prices. At the same time towns placed all kinds of restrictions generally known as municipal mercantilism on business activities. These include restricting commercial exchange to set times and places in the market, putting restrictions on non-townspeople in the town market, forbidding purchases for later sale in the same market, hampering or taxing export of goods from the town, and so forth. All such regulations, embodying what is technically called a policy of provision, had a very adverse influence on technological advance for most of the 14th century. The decrease in expansion arising from the growth of economic institutionalization was accelerated by a number of other factors. One of these was a fall of prices after 1300, accompanied, within a half-century, by the scarcity of labor. The fall of prices probably began with the decrease in demand arising from institutionalization, but it was greatly accelerated by the scarcity of bullion. By the year 1300 the accessible silver mines and scanty gold resources of Europe had been systematically exploited for centuries, and most of the easily obtained bullion had been extracted. Mines were becoming exhausted or were going deeper than could be operated easily by the available technology. The problem of keeping water out of the deeper mines was rapidly becoming insoluble. The ordinary lift pumps known at the time would not take water higher than about 30 feet, since they worked by air pressure, so that depths greater than this had to be pumped out in multiple stages. Problems of ventilation and of removing ores were also rising rapidly. As a consequence, after about 1320 the annual increase in the bullion supply and thus the increase in the volume of money were less than the increase in production of goods, and the long rise in prices was reversed. Costs, particularly wages, did not fall so rapidly as prices, with the result that profit margins price minus costs were reduced or wiped out completely. This discouraged production. The situation was alleviated for a short time just at the middle of the 14th century because the outbreak of the 100 Years' War in 1338 helped to strengthen prices, but profit margins hardly benefited at all, because the shortage of labor resulting from the onslaughts of the Black Death. After 1348 raised wages. Even today, when wages constitute a smaller portion of total costs, nothing will curtail production faster or more completely than rising wages in a time of falling prices. One rather paradoxical consequence of this situation was that incomes were distributed somewhat more equitably, and the standards of living of the poorer groups frequently improved in spite of the general economic decline. This meant that aggregate incomes, as a whole, were decreasing, but the share of the total income going to the working people was rising and the share of the upper classes was falling quite rapidly. As a consequence of this, both saving and investment, which were upper-class activities, decreased even more rapidly, and the depression worsened. This economic and social crisis of the 14th and early 15th centuries is well documented in the historical records. Josiah C. Russell tells us that the British population was 1.1 million in 1086 and rose very rapidly until about 1240, then increased more slowly during the next century and achieved a peak of about 3.7 million in 1348. It then decreased to 2.23 million by 1377 and to 2.1 million in the early 15th century, and was still at no more than 3.2 million in 1545. Poston tells us that all the towns of England, except Bristol and London, lost population from the 14th century to the 15th century. A similar pattern was being experienced on the continent. Ed and Ed Renaud report the population of Marseille fell by at least 75% in the period 1263 to 1423. Similar trends have been reported from most of Western and Central Europe. C.M. Chipola says that the crises of the early decades of the 14th century were comparable in their gravity to those that struck the modern world in 1929-35. In his study of Italian businessmen, Periodization says that economic enterprise was replaced by warfare after 1330 as the accepted method for making one's fortune. An old work of R. Davidson's gives us fairly specific figures for the manufacture of woolen cloth in Florence in the 14th century. 100,000 pieces in 1309. Only 70,000 in 1339, falling to 30,000 in 1373, and reaching 19,000 in 1382. Various explanations have been offered for these impious fortunes, such as the plague, growing public disorder, increased religious controversy, and others, but however these factors may have acted and reacted on one another, there can be no doubt that by the year 1380 Europe was in the kind of crisis we call an age of conflict. Naturally there were growing class conflicts as part of these crises. In England we have the plains of Langland and uprisings led by men like Wat Tyler and John Ball. In the Low Countries we find many similar disturbances even earlier, especially 1323-28 in France occurred the revolts of the Jacquerie and other disorders, while in Germany as a semi-peripheral area. These outbursts came somewhat later, culminating in the peasants' revolts of 1524. All these hardships and disorders led to a growth of irrationality, one of the most typical examples of this to be found in any age of conflict. All kinds of irrational heresies, like the flagellants or the beguines, became rampant in Europe. Witchcraft, astrology, even devil worship, dances of death, necromancy, and all degrees of despair and emotional desperation were prevalent. The tone of the age is clearly revealed in a man like Bion and well described by modern writers like Johann Huizinga or Millard Mice. The geographic expansion of Christendom, which reached its peak with Marco Polo 1271-95, largely ceased with that achievement and was only resumed a century later with the exploits of the Portuguese in a new age of expansion. The debasement of Europe's material, social, and spiritual life, which had continued for over a century and a half, was reversed, quite suddenly, just before the middle of the 15th century. About 1440 new life began to spring up, with new hopes and renewed ambitions. This new growth was based on the activities of a new instrument of expansion, commercial capitalism, a complete circumvention of the previous feudal organization that had originated the older period of expansion in the 10th century. This new instrument of expansion, which we call commercial capitalism, was a circumvention of feudalism, but it could just as well be regarded as a reform of the commercial organization of the Middle Ages. In the earlier period, demand, originally of feudal origin, had given rise to a commercial system whose symbols are Bruges, Venice, and Nuremberg. In the new age of expansion, which began about 1440, the original demand came from princes and dynastic monarchies, and gave rise to a new commercial organization whose symbols are Cadiz, Antwerp, and London. One aspect of the change is the shift from institutionalized Mediterranean commerce to instrumental Atlantic commerce. After the original impulse, feudalism or despotism, dynastic monarchy as the case may be, both organizations were capitalistic and commercial. By capitalism we mean an economic system motivated by the pursuit of profits within a price structure. Such profits can be derived either from the exchange of goods as happened in commercial capitalism or from the production of goods as occurred in the third period of Western expansion, which began about 1720. Either type of capitalism can become institutionalized, in which case profits are sought not from exchange or from production of goods but from restrictions on exchange and restrictions on production. This restrictive capitalism arose because profits, which are the real motive of any capitalistic system, are the margin between selling prices and costs. As long as a capitalistic organization is an instrument, it seeks to increase profits by reducing costs rather than by increasing prices. But when a capitalistic system becomes an institution, it shifts its efforts to trying to increase profits by increasing prices. Such increases in prices can generally be achieved only by reducing the flow of goods, either by restricting exchange or by restricting production. An effort to make this the chief method for maximizing profits indicates institutionalization of the organization. We have three different names for institutions. Dialectic capitalist systems which were dominant in the three ages of conflict of Western civilization. These are unicide, mercantilism in the period 1270 to 1440, state mercantilism in the period 1690 to 1810, and monopoly capitalism in the period 1900 and after. The new age of expansion after 1440 lasted until near the end of the 17th century. It is very familiar to all students of history and is frequently called the ambiguous term Renaissance. Even a neophyte in the study of history is aware that this period possessed the qualities we have listed as typical of any age of expansion: increased production, rising population, geographic expansion, growth of knowledge, and intermittent impulses of science and democracy. Except for geographical expansion and science, all these were probably less extreme, in a quantitative sense, than history textbooks might lead us to believe. But I think there can be no doubt that they existed sufficiently to justify the name expansion for the period as a whole. The two most dramatic aspects of the period, however, are to be seen in science and in exploration and colonization. In SCI, since the period from Copernicus, or even Leonardo, to Newton is recognized as one of the most brilliant in all history, while in geographic expansion the age of Vasco da Gama or Magellan is no less famous. In both of these fields, and in the others as well, the period of a century or more after 1690 is one of much more modest achievements. Only in the 19th century, with the surge of a new age of expansion, were the achievements of the 16th and early 17th centuries generally exceeded. The successive stages of expansion and conflict that we are trying to distinguish in the past 1,000 years of the history of our own civilization are even less definitely marked than similar stages in other civilizations. In addition to certain difficulties already mentioned, such as the inevitable lack of perspective occurring when we study our own society, there are other difficulties that arise from the cyclical character of these stages. Cultural lag and aberrations that emerge from the contrast between core and peripheral zones are especially troublesome in a civilization that repeats stages. We have already mentioned the problems that arise in demarking stages from the fact that such stages tend to be somewhat later in peripheral areas than they are in core areas. When stages are repeated, as in Western civilization, this gives rise to particular difficulties because peripheral areas could, in theory, fall one full stage behind the core area and thus mask the fluctuating process in the civilization as a whole. Fortunately, Western civilization did not have a full stage lag in its peripheral areas, but the lag was sufficiently prolonged to provide a masking influence on the demarcations of stages. In general, the core of Western civilization could be regarded as the northern half of Italy, France, the Low Countries, extreme Western Germany, and England without its Celtic fringes. The masking effect arose because of continued expansion in Germany and in the New World after this core had already moved into the next stage. There can be little doubt that the shift from expansion to conflict that occurred in the core of Western Europe at the end of the 13th century arrived somewhat later in Germany. Again, when Western Europe resumed expansion about 1440, Germany continued in the period of conflict for another century. And, finally, when the second stage of expansion reached its end in Western Europe in the late 17th century, it continued in Germany and in Mexico for several generations more. On the other hand, about 1840, when England, France, and, above all, Belgium were expanding vigorously in the third currents of expansion of Western civilization, Germany and Mexico were just about to resume expansion. The masking effect between stages to which we referred was intensified by cultural lag. This means that in any single area, be it core or not, all aspects of the society do not start, stop, or proceed at the same times and rates. In general, change or innovation was earlier in the military and economic aspects than it was in the political, social, legal, or intellectual aspects. This can be seen quite clearly in the early 16th century and again in the late 18th century. The last imperialist war of the First Age of Conflict was but a series of struggles called the Italian Wars 1494–1559. These began with an excuse rather than a cause, just as the earlier Hundred Years' War 1338–1445 had done. The cause of both of these was the need for the institutionalized feudal system to wage war in order to make a living. In other words, war had become an end in itself, as is usually the case with any institution. The excuse given in 1338 for the Angelish invasion of France, like the excuse given in 1494 for Charles VII's invasion of Italy, was no more than that, just an excuse, a flimsy dynastic claim to a distant throne. But in each case hordes of unemployed nobles were eager to support such a claim, no matter how flimsy, for the sake of booty and payment for military service. The first imperialist wars of the new age of conflict were the Wars of Louis Xiv, which began in 1667 and which continued, with interruptions, until after Waterloo in 1815. The excuses that Louis Xiv gave for his wars were just about as flimsy as those which had been offered in 1338 and 1494 in the earlier ages of conflict, and were repeated in the last of these wars by Napoleon. As far as our analysis goes, the Italian Wars of 1494–1559 should have been followed by a period of peace such as followed the Napoleonic Wars of 1803–15, since, in each case, a new period of expansion had begun. Let us note that expansion had fully begun even before these last imperialist wars commenced, since the second age of expansion began about 1440 and the third began about 1730. This was simply the result of cultural lag, and reflected a situation where older institutions continued to work for a war that newer instrumental developments had made unnecessary and unrewarding. A similar and parallel situation may be existing now, at the middle of the 20th century, if we are endangered by imperialist war at a time when new instruments and techniques of peaceful expansion have already begun to function. In the period 1815 to 1914, of course, there was an absence of imperialist war, and Europe was generally concentrating its resources and energies on expansion, and did so because the fact of expansion, especially the new industrialism, was too obvious for anyone to ignore the fact that it was more feasible to get ahead by peaceful methods than by warlike ones. But in the period of expansion from 1440 to 1680 this was not nearly so clear, chiefly because of cultural lag of behavior and thought patterns from the earlier age of conflict. We have said that the Italian Wars began in 1494 as a typical imperialist aggression by the institutionalized feudal system. But the war changed its character after about 25 years, and became a balance of power struggle against Habsburg hegemony. In 1494 the King of France was the aggressor, By 1520 the King of France was fighting for survival against a dynastic monster that had come into existence through a series of circumstances, some of them accidental, which had made the Habsburgs the overwhelming power in Europe. Among these circumstances were the family arrangements that accumulated by inheritance a large number of important dynastic claims in the hands of Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire. Of almost equal importance was the accidental circumstance that the same Habsburgs, as the rulers of Mexico and Peru, were able to tap the immense resources of bullion of America at a time when the existence of mercenary armies made money equivalent to soldiers and thus to power. The influx of American bullion that made the Habsburgs a great military and political power without an economic or social system capable of supporting a hegemony of Europe had several results. By raising prices rapidly it completed the ruin of the older nobility and any other persons on fixed incomes. At the same time this price inflation gave a great spur to economic, especially commercial expansion, and to the growth and wealth and influence of the bourgeoisie and richer peasants. Moreover, the revelation that the possession of money could make a dynasty powerful even without a sound economic and social system to support it fastened the mercantilist system, in a broader, more exploitative way upon Europe. Political power supported by mercenary soul, the purse was used to regulate economic activities so that a favorable balance of trade would bring in sufficient money to hire mercenary soldiers and thus expand a dynasty's ability to control more taxpayers, get access to larger numbers of mercenary recruits, and to increase the favorable balance of payments. These obsolescent ideas, which continued as a cultural lag during the course of the new second age of expansion, ensured a continuance of imperialist wars even in the period of expansion. The struggle against Habsburg hegemony that began after 1519 was ended with the Habsburg political defeat in the 30 Years' War 1618–48. The struggle against French hegemony in Europe that began in 1667 continued until 1815. But the interval between these two struggles, which should have been a period of peace, was not, because of economic struggles, such as the three Anglo-Dutch wars, which were justified by institutionalized mercantilist ideologies. Moreover, only local and sporadic movements toward democracy appeared in this period of expansion because the organization of military force and of political power was not such as to permit democracy to function. The Italian wars of 1494–1559 were like a cauldron in which a great variety of military ideas and tactics were thrown together and tested. Among these were the old mounted knight, the new infantry of English crossbowmen or Swiss pikemen, the even newer infantry of arquebusiers, the light cavalry rider armed with horse pistols, primitive artillery, and even a Spanish revival of the Roman legionary. From the competition of these various arms there emerged by 1559 a tactical combination of pike and arquebus that held the field for over 2 centuries. In this combination the pikemen defended the arquebusiers against charging horsemen, while the arquebusiers defended the pikemen against forearms. At first, slowness of reloading, which left arquebusiers in jeopardy from cavalry for long intervals, required a high ratio of pikemen in the unit, but the slow increase in rate of firing and the invention of the ring bayonet which made each musketeer able to act as his own pikeman, in 1690 led to the reduction and eventual elimination of pikes. But the use of muskets, either with pikes or bayonets for defense against cavalry, supplemented by artillery, remained a skilled task as long as guns remained muzzle-loading, spark-ignited weapons. Such skill could be obtained only from professional mercenary soldiers in the relatively small numbers that could be paid by dynastic monarchies in the mercantilist period. In this period this organizational feature of small, professional mercenary armies was reinforced by the fact that arms were handmade on a piece-by-piece basis and were thus too expensive for the average private citizen to obtain or for the public fisc to purchase on a mass basis. Accordingly, it is not surprising that political power remained concentrated in the narrow group who controlled this limited supply of weapons and did not spread to that majority who were relatively isolated from war and weapons and thus had no basis on which to establish any claims for participation in governmental functions. This narrow basis for military activity in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries fully sustains the narrow distribution of political power in the same period. Accordingly, it became relatively easy for the vested interest groups to defend the status quo and to prevent structural changes when the new period of crisis began at the end of the 17th century. The second period of expansion in Western civilization was transformed into a second age of conflict when the instrument of expansion became an institution. The two phases of this organization are generally called commercial capitalism and state mercantilism. The preceding period of mercantilism, which we called municipal mercantilism, generally had been regulated by municipal political units rather than by the wider monarchical political units of the 18th century. It had been dominated by the interests of the consumer and had reflected this concern in a policy of provision that put restrictions on exports but not on imports, and tried to regulate craft activities to protect quality. By 1400 this policy had become very restrictive. The second phase of mercantilism was organized on a different basis with different aims, since it was generally regulated by dynastic monarchies and generally sought to protect the interests of commercial groups. As such, it had no interest in restricting either imports or exports, but rather sought to make goods go through the territory so that fees of handling and the profits of exchange could be ensured to the citizens. This is frequently called the policy of the staple, and contrasts both with the policy of provision of the first age of conflict and with the policy of protection of the third age of conflict that associated with monopoly capitalism after 1900. These three policies represent the interests of three different aspects of the economic system. Any economic system must provide production, distribution, and consumption. Each of the three ages of conflict of Western civilization sought to protect the vested interests of one of these aspects, but in the reverse order, so that the consumer was dominant in the first period about 1400, the trader was dominant in the second about 1750, and the producer was dominant in the third about 1930. Any effort to make means into ends, or to make one section or aspect of a process the dominant interest of the whole process, is a clear indication of institutionalization. This process of institutionalization can be seen as a kind of general stagnation of Western civilization during most of the century from 1650 to 1750. The geographic expansion that had spread in such a phenomenal way in the period 1450 to 1650 began to hesitate. In North America, the colonies remained east of the Appalachians, or, in some areas, below the fault line. In South America, the incredible explorations of the earlier period, which, for example, had seen the continent crossed from west to east by way of the Amazon, were not repeated until the 19th century. In the history of Africa we find a similar situation. In most areas of the Dark Continent there were widespread explorations and missionary activities. Even the transcontinental journey in the 16th century. But then nothing similar occurred again until the 19th century. The expansion into India and the Far East shows a similar, but less drastic, hesitancy. The same cycle can be seen in legislation, which devoted itself, after about 1650, to the defense of the status quo, or to the effort, by political action, to obtain a larger share for oneself of what was regarded as a static and unexpandable body of the world's wealth. This can be seen in the navigation acts that the English colonies in America so resented in the period after 1765, but that were first enacted after 1649. These acts sought to prevent economic innovations in the colonies and to force their trade and commodity ties to go through England and English hands, whatever their ultimate destination. At the same time, within England, technical innovation was discouraged. Work became an end in itself, and laws were made to preserve existing markets as they stood. In a semi-statistical study, Change and History, published in 1952, Margaret T. Hodgin found three periods of technical innovation in Western history. These were the 11th century to the 14th century, the 16th century, and the 19th century. Governments did all they could to discourage such innovation in the late 17th century. In contrast to the late 16th, then they still sought to reward it. In England the patent power was used to prevent new techniques rather than to encourage them. As early as 1623 the Privy Council ordered destruction of a machine for making needles. Cloth buttons rather than bone were forbidden in 1698, while Indian calico was forbidden in 1686. The law of 1666 ordered all persons to be buried in wool rather than in the traditional linen. Every effort was made to prevent new techniques in the textile industry and thus, in effect, to hamper the growth of cotton textiles. In France, these efforts culminated in the crafts codes of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, issued in 7 volumes of 2,200 pages over the period 1666 to 1730. These sought to prescribe every detail of the established craft techniques and to proscribe innovations in these. Economic aims and economic values were distorted and frequently reversed so that consumption was condemned as an evil, abundance a hoard, work praised as an end in itself, exporting incorporated, and poverty regarded as a good because it was the only way to keep people working. The esteemed Sir William Petty 1662 believed that a country could get richer and richer by exporting more and more, and that it would be a good thing if the products of the labor of 1,000 men could be burned, since these men could then keep their skills by having to make the goods over again. Charles Davenant in 1698 wrote, "By what is consumed at home one loseth only what another gets, and the nation in general is not all the richer. But all foreign consumption is a clear and certain profit." More briefly, in 1673 Becker wrote, "All selling is good, all buying bad," while in 1677 John Houghton drew a logical conclusion from these ideas by suggesting that England could get richer by inviting foreigners to come in to consume our corn, cattle, cloths, coals, and other things. It was suggested that an enemy in wartime could be greatly weakened if he could be flooded with goods, and as late as 1810, that last great mercantilist, Napoleon, issued licenses to smugglers to carry goods into England secretly. De Manville praised vice because it was unproductive, while Defoe praised the law forbidding a more efficient Pinalbo able to do the same work with fewer men. It can hardly be expected that ideas and statements such as these could be fitted together to provide any self-consistent and convincing economic theory, but even as they stand they reveal a determination to defend isolated vested interests such as prevail in a period of institutionalized organizations. As might be expected in such a period, the century 1650-1750 was one of imperialist wars, of class conflicts, of flattening population expansion, of softening prices, and of irrational confusions. Of these the class conflicts and imperialist wars continued until 1815, although a new age of expansion had begun as early as 1730. Napoleon was the culmination of this age of conflict, seeking to establish a universal empire and almost succeeding in the core area by 1811, seeking to enforce his mercantilist conceptions with the full authority of his imperial system, and quite convinced that he was living in a limited world, in which one's share could be increased only if another were curtailed. In these wars Napoleon was fighting the wave of the future with the methods of the past. This can be seen quite clearly if we merely look at 4 or 5 aspects of the new 19th century of expansion. In financial matters, one of the great problems of Western civilization from the earliest period had been fluctuations and, above all, limitations on the volume of money. So long as money was in the form of specie, there could be no close correlation between the volume of money available and the economic need for money as a medium of savings and exchange. The volume of money was strictly related to the supply of bullion, except for minor influences like hoarding, flows of specie to India and the East, and such, but this supply was in no way related to economic needs. We have seen that the supply increased too rapidly in the 3 centuries 1000 to 1300, then increased far too slowly because of exhaustion of existing mines within the framework of the existing technology for the next century and half 1300 to 1450 then was expanded in a spectacular and accidental way, quite out of relationship to economic need, by Spanish access to the bullion stores of Mexico and Peru 1450 to 1650, but that the diffusion of these stores left the economy of Western civilization on an inflated price level that could not be sustained by any continued increase in bullion supplies. Thus, by the late 17th century and much of the 18th century, the flow of bullion was not sufficient to satisfy either the demands of an expanding economic system or those of the mercantilist political system supported by a mercenary military system. This inadequacy began to be remedied at the very end of the 17th century, notably by the establishment of the Bank of England in 1694. This remedy rested on the use of banknotes backed to only a fractional part of their value by specie reserves. This was a partial solution of the problem of money for 2 reasons. 1. It permitted a great increase in the volume of money when the supply of bullion was increasingly inadequate, and 2. It permitted the volume of money to fluctuate to some extent in response to changing needs for money in the economy. This new technique of monetary manipulation became one of the basic factors in the Great Age of Expansion in the 19th century and made the fluctuations of economic activity less responsive to the rate of bullion production from mines, by making it more responsive to new factors reflecting the demand for money, such as the interest rate. This new technique spread relatively slowly in the century between the founding of the Bank of England and Napoleon's creation of the Bank of France in 1803. The Napoleonic Wars, because of the backward, specie-based financial ideas of Napoleon, were, on their fiscal side, a struggle between the older, boldness, obsolete system favored by Napoleon and the new fractional reserve banknote system of England. A similar situation existed in regard to food production. No very impressive economic expansion was possible in the 18th century without some new agricultural techniques capable of increasing the output of food. No such increase could be expected so long as the medieval field system with its unenclosed scattered strips and free-ranging farm animals continued. This medieval system had been a great success in its day, greatly superior to the old classical two-field slave system, and capable of supporting the new Western civilization through its first 2 ages of expansion. But by 1650 its output per man-day of work was not sufficient to support any notable increase of the proportion of the population in crafts and trade, and it was, of course, quite incapable of providing the food or raw materials for industrialism. This medieval organization of agriculture was fully institutionalized by 1650 and had become a great obstacle to continued expansion. Just at that point, however, there became available in Western Europe the elements of the new agrarian system fully capable of supporting a new period of expansion and destined to do so in the 19th century. The new organization of agriculture is usually known as the Agricultural Revolution. In essence, it abandoned the three-field system for a leguminous rotation system in which a leguminous crop was put in place of the fallow stage in the older three-stage cycle. Such a leguminous crop like alfalfa or clover put much more nitrogen in the field than any fallow year ever could, but it required a major reorganization in livestock handling. Animals had to be fenced in rather than fenced out of the arable field as in the older system, because the fallow and, to a lesser degree, the stubble, on which medieval livestock had foraged, were gone. Fencing of animals for enclosure had 3 important results. 1. Selective breeding could be practiced, with a great improvement in the quality of farm animals. 2. Animal manure was now available in quantity to be used where its fertility was most needed. And 3. Feed had to be supplied to the animals, thus providing the use for the leguminous crop that had been put into the fallow stage of the older cycle. There was thus a drastic increase in size, quality, and numbers of farm animals as a consequence of the agricultural revolution. As an index of this we might note that the slaughter weights of farm animals tripled at Smithfield Market in England during the 85-year period ending in 1795. The agricultural revolution did not cease with the factors we have mentioned, but included a number of other significant items. Enclosure ejected a considerable number of subsistence peasants from the agrarian system and led to larger holdings and some degree of rural depopulation, thus providing manpower for increased commerce and industry. It also made possible numerous other technical advances, many of them associated with the ideas of rural eccentrics like Jethro Tull 1711. These included planting of seed in rows, in holes in the ground, by use of a seed drill instead of broadcast surface sowing as in the Middle Ages. This encouraged seed selection and the use of horse-drawn cultivators. The agricultural revolution was the basis of the new age of expansion that began in England about 1730 but that had not yet reached France a generation later. This fact was perfectly clear to Arthur Young when he travelled in France just before the French Revolution. As a consequence, the Napoleonic Wars were, from this point of view, a conflict between the older three-field fallow system and the newer enclosed leguminous rotation systems frequently called in France and elsewhere, the Norfolk system. There was also a third important element in this situation. This was the shift from a craft system of manufacture to an industrial system. The vital point about this shift is not so much the growth of the factory system or the growth of an urban proletariat that did not own the tools it used, as the shift from an economy in which production was achieved by energy released in living bodies, man, or animal power, to one in which production was achieved by energy released through non-living mechanisms, water power or steam and vines. This shift, which permitted great increases in production of manufactured goods, would never have been possible without the agricultural revolution that preceded it, and possibly without the advent of a fractional reserve banking system as well. The change, which is usually called the Industrial Revolution, was in full development in England but was largely unknown in France during Napoleonic Wars. In this regard, also, these wars represented a conflict between the newer organization for fulfilling human desires and an older, obsolescent one. There is a fourth way in which Napoleonic Wars represented a struggle between the new and the old. On Napoleonic side we find ranged all the forces of mercantilism, meaning the theories and the vested interest forces that believed that economic life had to be regulated by the government and regulated for largely political ends. This system played a very significant role in Western civilization in the period 1200 to 1800, but by the latter day it was clearly obsolete, and had to be replaced by a more advanced system. This newer system of economic management is known as laissez-faire and, as is well known, it was associated with the period of expansion of the 19th century. What is not so well known, however, is what the shift from one to another really entailed. Every economic system has to be regulated. That is, somehow, decisions must be made as to what is produced, how much of it, and who gets it. In the early Middle Ages and again in the late 19th century, the European system of management was an unregulated, automatic one. That is, no centralized decision-making occurred in either. But the two were entirely dissimilar in the ways that this came about. In the medieval system, economic regulation was automatic through medieval custom. What was produced, how much, and who got it were established on the basis of what had been done at an earlier date. Custom ruled. In the 19th century, once again, Europe had an automatic management of economic life, but now it was a dynamic economic system, not the static one of the earlier Middle Ages, and, as a dynamic system, it could not be regulated by custom. Instead, it was regulated by the market. The market is a place where buyers and sellers come together to exchange their goods. In an automatic laissez-faire market, numerous sellers compete with each other, thus forcing prices downward, while simultaneously numerous buyers compete with each other, thus forcing prices upward. And, finally, during all this, buyers haggle with sellers. As a consequence of these three forces operating in the market, the price is reached at which goods are exchanged for money in terms that will clear the market of both. Such a market mechanism is fully capable, as we all know, of determining, without centralized control, what will be produced, how much will be made, and who will get it. But no laissez-faire system can do this unless a market exists. And no such market can exist unless both transportation and communications are so highly developed and so free that people know what is going on, and both goods and money are free to move where each is more valuable. Neither transportation nor communications were adequate to this purpose when the customary system of the static medieval economy began to break down from the introduction of dynamic economic influences about the year 1000. Thus there was no market in the year 1000, and there was still no market, although a myriad of small markets. In 1700, these small markets existed from the inadequacy of both transportation and communication, and were small in the sense that the numbers of buyers and the numbers of sellers in each market were too small to prevent monopolistic or oligopolistic prices and to achieve competitive prices. To prevent this and to protect the consumer from exploitation, unicide, mercantilism grew up and dominated economic regulation during the period 1200 to 1500 approximately. As improvements in transportation and communications appeared in the period of medieval expansion, there was a tendency for the numerous small markets regulated by municipal mercantilism to flow together to create fewer and larger markets. These larger markets, drawing from areas larger than the areas of municipal control and similarly supplying goods to larger areas, could not be controlled by municipal authorities. Still, these authorities continued to attempt to do what was technically beyond their powers to do. These efforts, aiming at the defense of established vested interests rather than at the protection of consumers as originally intended, are part of the institutionalized structure of the first age of conflict. As a consequence of the inability of municipal authorities to regulate the newer, larger markets created by improved transportation and communications, this task was taken over by the emerging dynastic monarchies. We have already shown how changes in weapons, political organization, and political ideology had created these newer political structures with power to regulate economic life over larger areas. This newer economic regulation by dynastic monarchies is known as state mercantilism. It aimed to protect traders rather than consumers or producers. Much of the expansion of the second period of expansion arose from its efforts. By the 18th century, state mercantilism had become in its turn a structure of vested interests serving to hamper economic life rather than to help it. This was as true of traders as it was of consumers and producers. This shift of state mercantilism from an instrument to an institution was based on two chief features. On one hand, the organization was no longer used for an economic purpose but had become an end in itself with largely political purposes. It was used to increase state power rather than for economic life. On the other hand, by the late 18th century, transportation and communication were again beginning to improve so rapidly that continental and even world markets were coming into existence. These were, of course, much wider than the areas of power of the dynastic monarchies and, accordingly, could not be controlled by them. The continued efforts of governments to exercise such control in the portions of markets that fell in their respective power areas merely served to create restrictions on economic life and hampered production, exchange, and consumption alike. This situation was shown by Adam Smith in his book The Wealth of Nations in 1776. Clearly, markets were now large enough to be regulated by supply and demand, by competition and higgling, and any movement to allow this would be economically progressive. From this point of view, also, the Napoleonic Wars represented a struggle between the older and the younger system. Thus, from 4 points of view concerned with finance, agriculture, manufacturing, and economic regulation, the political struggles between England and France in the Napoleonic period reflect the contest between the future and the past. There are, of course, numerous other factors involved in this contrast. Some of these will be mentioned in the next section, but these 4 should be sufficient to show that Napoleon represented an outmoded system and that he was the last phase of a fairly typical age of conflict. The other marks of such an age of conflict, with one notable exception, are fairly obvious or have been mentioned already. The exception is in intellectual history, where an age of conflict usually is a period of irrationality. This is, of course, not a term that could be applied to the 18th century, where the more usual label, at least for the generation 1730 to 90, is Enlightenment. This discrepancy is but one indication of a situation that is far too complex to be discussed here, namely, that the periodization of intellectual history is quite different from the periodization of other aspects of society. In these other aspects we can distinguish 5 successive stages on each level over the period from AD 950 into the future, but on the intellectual level, as shown in the chart page 389, we have at least 9 stages over the same time. To some extent this can be explained by cultural lag, but there are other influences quite as significant, including the much weaker degree of integration between one theory and another, even at the same time, or between the theory and any other aspect of the society, than exists between the more concrete aspects of culture. At any period it is possible for a thinker either to accept a theory which is morphologically compatible with his age or to reject it. In such cases the ideology of the age must be sought in the generally unstated assumptions made both by conformists and nonconformists. In the 18th century the Enlightenment was nonconformist to the other levels of the society, and this is, indeed, one of the chief causes of the French Revolution. The rational, orderly, organized ties of the Enlightenment were quite incompatible with the irrational, disorderly, and disorganized society of the day, and thus gave rise to tensions that, reinforced from other directions, provided the energy motivating the French Revolution. The irrationality to be associated with the second age of conflict might be sought either in the intellectual stage that preceded the Enlightenment or with the Romantic movement that followed it. In the former case it would be associated with such items as the political theory of Hobbes and with Jansenism, while in the latter case it would be associated with the literary movements that began with Richardson or Macpherson's Ossian and developed into Rousseau, Sturm und Drang, Wordsworth, and others, or with the political theories of men like Burke, Fichte, Bohlt, or de Maistre, and the religious movements represented by Methodism. On the whole, it seems preferable, without being dogmatic, to associate the latter intellectual stage with the irrationalism we expect from an age of conflict. But, at any rate, the subject is too complicated to be discussed in any satisfactory way here. The Third Age of Expansion lasted from about 1730 to about 1929, although indications of a new age of conflict began to appear as early as 1890. Its instrument of expansion remained capitalistic, but operating in fields other than those that had become institutionalized in the earlier age of conflict of the late 17th century. The reappearance of expansion clearly resulted from circumvention of this previous organization. Again, the period of expansion can be divided into substages that make the process of expansion appear as a series of steps or surges. We might list these steps as follows. 1. The agricultural revolution from 1730. 2. The industrial revolution from 1770. 3. Financial capitalism from 1850. And 4. Monopoly capitalism from 1900. Naturally, the dates listed are very rough, because the advent of these steps is quite different in various areas. We have already indicated the nature of the agricultural revolution as a reform of the institutionalized medieval three-field fallow system. Its roots go back many generations, but it began to operate as a significant, expansive force in England about 1730. It is, of course, one of the most important events in modern history. Two revolutionary events of the later 18th century contributed a good deal toward the new age of expansion. These were the Transportation Revolution, which began about 1750, and the Population Revolution, which began about a generation later. The Transportation Revolution consists of a series of innovations that provided A. an effective traveling coach, B. hard-surfaced, all-weather roads, C. fine rails, D. telegraphic communication, and E. rail roads. All these appeared in the century 1750 to 1850. In the following century, the revolution in transportation and communications continued with the advent of F. high-speed printing presses, G. the internal combustion engine, leading to automobiles and airplanes, and H. electricity, leading to radio, the motion picture, and television. The population revolution began about 1780 with the use of vaccination for smallpox. It continued with the discovery of germ infection and the invention of antiseptics by Pasteur and Lister, as well as improvements in surgery such as the discovery of ether. Advances of this kind have continued with accelerating rapidity and have given rise to a population explosion resulting from a drastic reduction in death rates far sharper than the slight decreases in birth rates. The transportation and population revolutions occurred most conveniently between the agricultural and industrial revolutions in Western civilization, each of the four providing a sound basis for the next. This was quite different from the experience of the non-Western world where these and other revolutionary advances diffused in a quite different sequence that was far better fitted to raising problems than to solving them. The Industrial Revolution, which we have defined as production by energy coming through non-living mechanisms, that is, from water power or steam rather than from men or animals, is familiar to all of us. Accordingly, we shall refer only to certain organizational features that help to distinguish its early period of owner management from its second period of financial capitalism. In the former, the typical pattern of organization was the private firm or partnership with both capital and decision-making supplied by the owners. In the latter, the typical form of organization was the limited liability corporation and the holding company, in which capital came from the owners but decision-making came from the management. As is well known, the Industrial Revolution first flourished in textiles using either water power or steam engines. Even when it spread into mining and iron making, the older form of proprietorship or partnership continued to prevail. But gradually it spread into the activities of the still expanding transportation revolution. There, in canal building and, above all, in railroad building, it became impossible to continue to use a partnership form of business organization because the needs for capital were far greater than could be satisfied by the savings of any group of partners. The corporate form of enterprise was adopted for these activities because it could mobilize the savings of many in the control of a few and do so with limited liability for the many. First used on a large scale in railroads, it soon spread into coal mining, iron making, and machine building. This change led to the period of financial capitalism that began about 1850 and died a violent death about September 1931 with the collapse of the international gold standard. As the period developed, the need for capital by corporations became so great that specialized capital-raising organizations appeared. These investment bankers, in return for their services, obtained representation on the boards of directors of corporations and sufficient influence to direct their company's financial services and purchases toward other corporations where the particular investment bankers concerned had interests. From this there grew up a network of interlocking directorships and banking influences and, finally, an elaborate system of holding companies and financial firms. These growing monopolistic influences were centralized by the joint concern which all financiers had in keeping the value of money high or stabilized, as they called it. This joint concern was reflected in the appearance of a joint organization, the central bank, which held the gold reserves that became the central feature of the monetary system. The international gold standard became the chief mechanism by which the supply of money could be kept low and its value, accordingly, kept high. The high value of money, which implies the low supply of money, was chiefly advantageous to creditors, to whom obligations were owed in money terms. But such a high value of money clearly meant low prices of goods, and was of disadvantage to debtors and to manufacturers of goods. Thus there appeared the dichotomy between bankers and industrialists, with one eager for a high value of money and high interest rates, while the other was eager for high prices of goods, thus low value of money and low interest rates. For a long time the dichotomy between the two did not come into the open because bankers succeeded in befuddling industrialists on financial matters, presenting them as abstruse subjects in which the industrialist's wisest course would be to follow his banker's advice. As long as the industrialist was dependent upon the banker for capital, he had to use that advice, even when he sometimes suspected that the interests of the two were not identical. But few industrialists before Henry Ford even realized that the interests of bankers and industrialists were opposed. This opposition of interests between the two appeared most clearly when there was an insufficient supply of money for the growing industrial structure. This insufficient supply of money was based on the insufficient supply of gold, since the bankers controlled the supply of money through the mechanism of the gold standard. The bankers called the use of the gold standard stabilization, and insisted that it provided a stable value to money. It did no such thing, but rather provided stable foreign exchanges for all currencies based on gold and a growing value to money. The growing value to money on the gold standard occurred because the supply of money could not increase as rapidly as the supply of goods when the former was based on output of the world's gold mines and the latter was based on the much more expandable industrial system. Accordingly, the overall tendency was for prices to soften during the whole period 1770 to 1931, except when there were sudden increases in the world's gold supplies, notably in 1848 to 52 and 1896. 1904, or when political events, such as wars, made it necessary to suspend the gold standard or to destroy quantities of goods, as in 1792 to 1815, 1861 to 72 and 1914 to 19. Outside these exceptional events, the general tendency of the price history of the Third Age of Expansion was deflationary, as was evident in 1816 to 48, 1872 to 96, 1920 to 33. This tendency led, in each deflationary substage, to growing depreciation and to increasing agrarian and labor unrest associated with such historic labels as the Hungry Forties, the least movement, and the Great World Depression. The tendency generally benefited bankers and injured industry by increasing the value of money and the costs of credit and making profitable industrial operations more difficult, since falling prices force businessmen to incur costs on an earlier and higher price level than that on which they must subsequently offer their product for sale. In these deflationary periods, as low prices drove corporations to bankruptcy, bankers were able to assume control of them, to consolidate them into larger units of monopolized industry, and to reap the profits of reorganization and reflotation of securities. Although industrialists and businessmen generally accepted the bankers' justifications of these events, debtors, especially farmers and workers who suffered unemployment, were increasingly resentful. The first deflationary period, leading to the disturbances of the late 1840s, and the second, leading to the disturbances of the early 1890s, were both ended by the discovery of new gold supplies in California and Australia in 1848-50, and in South Africa and the Klondike in 1897-1900. In addition, the supply of gold, in the second case, was increased by new methods of extracting gold from its ores. But none of these occurred in the third deflationary period, 1919-31, and financial capitalism, long threatened by its own creation, monopoly capitalism, perished in 1931-33. As a consequence, the domination of economic life by financial figures, such as Rothschild, Morgan, Rothbard, Baring, Montague Norman, or even Ivor Kreuger, was ended and replaced by great figures of monopoly capitalism like DuPont, Melt, Leverhulme, Rockefeller, Ford, Nuffield, and others. In this connection, however, it should be pointed out that the typical figure of monopoly capitalism is not the individual captain of industry of the earlier period, but the anonymously managed superfirm like United Chimot, Chinery, IG Farben Industrial, Unilever, DuPont Chemicals, Hartford Empire, Alcoa, Volkswagen, Puccini, General Motors, General Electric, or General Dynamics. It should also be noted that the generally deflationary character of the 19th century had certain beneficial aspects, such as wider distribution of goods at lower prices and, above all, the drastic need to lower costs of production by greater productive efficiency in order to ensure continued profits in a soft price era. These two aspects of the period explain why the 19th century remained an age of expansion in spite of its adjustment difficulties. It is not necessary to point out that the general characteristics we have posited for an age of expansion were in full flower during the 19th century. Geographic expansion was resumed so that Africa, the polar regions, the Mato Grosso, and New Guinea became familiar areas. Population soared, production increased, even in periods of falling prices. Knowledge expanded beyond anyone person's comprehension. Even democracy and science reached their greatest victories. Indeed, the 19th century in terms of our description of an age of expansion could be the age of expansion par excellence. In the military and political levels, the third age of expansion was associated with such familiar historical developments as the mass citizen army, the national state, and democracy. The shift to these from the older stages of these levels generally occurred during the era of the French Revolution and Napoleon. The reasons for these changes should be examined because, while often mentioned, they are rarely analyzed. The second age of conflict had been associated with the professional mercenary army, the dynastic monarchy, and authoritarian government. On the economic and social level, it had been associated with mercantilism and the supremacy of the bureaucracy. As is well known, these last two stages were replaced, on their respective levels, by laissez-faire and the bourgeoisie in the 19th century. Any analysis of the process that gave rise to these extensive changes on all levels of culture might well begin with the military situation. In the second age of conflict, the best available weapons in Western civilization were artillery, muskets, and pikes or bayonets. These were difficult to use and usually expensive to obtain. As a result, they could be used only by trained men and could be bought only by a relatively well-to-do entity. Such trained men had to be professional users of weapons, and the weapons had to be provided by the state or by the wealthy. All of this taken together meant that weapons were available only to a small minority of the population and that the majority must expect, as a general rule, to yield to the authority of the minority that controlled these weapons. Thus it followed, almost as a matter of course, that the political level had to be authoritarian. The organization of that authority into a dynastic monarchy was a consequence of the governmental traditions of Europe. As the system operated, it was expected that allegiance and loyalty would be given to the family of the ruling monarch, in order to assure succession to his heir. This loyalty was not really expected from all persons, but only from the significant ones: the clergy, the nobility, the chief bourgeoisie, and all guild members, and possibly from well-to-do independent peasantry. But the ordinary peasantry and the guild apprentices, as persons of little significance, were not subjects of much concern about their allegiance of loyalty. The operation of mercantilism and the social superiority of the royal bureaucracy were also dependent, if less directly, on the organization and control of the military level. Thus the structure of all four levels, military, political, economic control, and social, was based on the military organization of professional mercenary soldiers. In the age of Napoleon and just after it, this military organization was modified greatly into a quite new system that survived for over a century. This innovation was the mass citizen army fighting for patriotism rather than for pay. The new organization was made possible by a series of innovations in weapons and tactics, and in military, as well as political, organization. In weapons, the arrival of the Industrial Revolution and of mass-produced firearms based on interchangeable parts lowered the cost of weapons at the same time that the general economic expansion was raising standards of living. These two intercepting factors made it possible for the average man, in areas where these factors were operating, to obtain guns at a cost that he could afford to pay, that is, no more than his earning power over a few weeks. These guns were becoming easier to use by the shift from spark ignition to percussion ignition and breech loading. All these innovations made it possible to arm large masses of men at relatively lower cost. At the same time, the shift to such a mass army was made possible by changes in political organization. The political organization that we have called dynastic monarchy could continue only so long as the best weapon available in the society could be obtained only by a minority. As soon as a majority could obtain the best available weapon and use it with little training, it became impossible for any minority to enforce obedience on a majority, and accordingly, the authoritarian structure of political life began to crumble. A reorganization of political life became necessary. This reorganization of the political structure had a double aspect. On the one hand, it became necessary to shift from minority rule to majority rule, and on the other hand it became necessary to find a new political organization that could place its appeal to allegiance on a basis that could be used for the majority of the society. This new basis was nationalism, and a new organization, which succeeded the dynastic state in the early 19th century, is known as the national state, prevalent from about 1800 to about 1950. The political shift from dynastic monarchy to national state and the shift in weapons from a professional mercenary army to a mass army of citizens allowed the cost of a man's service to be reduced, since he fought for patriotism instead of for money, and permitted a great change in military tactics, since patriotic men were more willing to die than were mercenary soldiers. The older tactics of the dynastic monarchs had favored wars of maneuver with limited forces for limited aims. By wars of maneuver we mean tactics in which enemy forces were dislodged from their positions by cutting their communications and supplies rather than by assault, with battles occurring only rarely and chiefly from accidental collisions during shifts of position. Such wars were long drawn out, with few battles, and could be ended at any time by negotiation because of the possibility of compromising the combatants' limited and concrete goals. The advent of patriotic mass armies made it possible to force the enemy from his position by assault rather than by maneuver. The new tactics, worked out by Napoleon in the period 1795 to 1815, organized this assault in 3 steps: artillery barrage, bayonet attack by infantry, and cavalry pursuit. All 3 steps were innovations, but the greatest change was in the second, where the bayonet was entirely transformed from its earlier role as a defensive weapon against cavalry to an offensive weapon against opposing infantry. It was the nature of this second, and central, step in the new tactics that made necessary the innovations in the use of artillery and cavalry in the 2 other steps. the possibility of heavy casualties in the second step of the new tactics, in which bayonets were sent against fire power, made it necessary to obtain very high morale from citizen soldiers. This high morale could not be obtained so long as the aims of war remained, as in the earlier period, limited and concrete. They had to be made unlimited and idealistic, saving the revolution or civilization, making the world safe for democracy, freedom of the seas, rights of small nations, and similar unobtainable abstractions. Such goals could not be compromised, and, accordingly, battles had to become conflicts of annihilation in which the survival of the contending regimes was at stake. Such battles of annihilation led to a series of brief one-battle wars such as the French-Austrian War of 1859, the Prussian-Austrian War of 1866, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, the Russo-Turkish War of 1877, and the Spanish-American War of 1899. Even as this pattern was being established, however, new forces were arising that laid the basis for quite a different pattern in the 20th century. These new forces were: 1. The growing importance of ideological forces, which made it less likely that a people would accept the consequences of death in a single battle, and 2. The growing strength of the tactical defensive, which made it less necessary to yield to such a defeat in one battle. The growing ideological influence was clearly evident in the American Civil War, the struggle with the French guerrillas, and the Paris Commune after Sedan in 1871, the Boer War of 1899 to 1902, and, above all, World War I. The growing importance of the defensive made the second step of Napoleonic battle, the bayonet offensive, less and less likely to be decisive, and made it less and less possible that the outcome of the battle itself could be decisive. The growing strength of the defensive rested on the rapid growth of firepower after the invention of the machine gun about 1862. This made both bayonet and cavalry obsolete. The increasing use of field fortifications thus reduced the effectiveness of both artillery barrage and of offensive firepower. The invention of barbed wire about 1879 thus hampered the infantry charge of the second step and the cavalry pursuit of the third, and of the airplane in 1903 this took from the cavalry its only surviving role as reconnaissance. The tactical changes made necessary by these innovations were not recognized by military men until after they had inflicted the almost unbearable casualties of 1916–17, but these changes, such as use of tanks, infiltration, aerial bombardment, and the like, made weapons once again so expensive and so difficult to use that it became increasingly needful to replace the mass citizen army by an army of specialists. Such a change, by reserving instruments of force to a minority, reversed the trend on the political level to a new development from democracy toward authoritarian government. The date of this reversal might be fixed in 1934, the year that the German General Guderian read de Gaulle's book Army of Specialists. At the same time, it became clear that rapid improvements in weapons, communications, radio, transportation, trucks and organization made it possible to enforce obedience to orders over geographic distances far greater than those covered by any national groups. Accordingly, appeal to political allegiance on nationality grounds became obsolete, and it became necessary to make such an appeal on some much wider basis. The new basis, now in process of being discovered, was common ideological outlook. Accordingly, the stage of the national state began to be replaced by the stage of the ideological state or bloc on the level of political organization, and the area covered by a single political unit widened from the nation to the continental bloc. The inability of Hitler to make such a shift from a nationalist to an ideological or other wider basis at a time when his factual power was so much wider geographically than the area of Germanism was but one of his fatal errors. This change has been recognized in popular discussion and carried, perhaps, to a degree not justified by the actual facts. We are told that we now live in a two-powered world, although the power of the United States and of the Soviet Union is not in fact hemispherical. Each of these superpowers can, it is true, obtain obedience in most matters over about 40% of the Earth's surface, but this leaves a buffer area between, amounting to about a fifth of the Earth. This buffer fringe lying between the Soviet heartland and the peripheral, and ocean-linked, Western civilization is occupied by the shattered remnants of dying civilizations or the hopeful efforts of incipient new civilizations. The hope of the future does not rest, as commonly believed, in winning the peoples of the buffer fringe to one superpower or the other, but rather in the invention of new weapons and new tactics that will be so cheap to obtain and so easy to use that they will increase the effectiveness of guerrilla warfare so greatly that the employment of our present weapons of mass destruction will become futile, and, on this basis, there can be a revival of democracy and of political decentralization in all three parts of our present world. This possible development in military and political matters would, of course, require the development of decentralized economic techniques such as could arise if sunlight became the chief energy source for production and the advance of science made it possible to manufacture any desired substance by molecular rearrangement of such common materials as seawater, plant fibers, and ordinary earth. Hopes such as these are far in the future and could be fulfilled only if one showdown conflict between the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc is indefinitely postponed and if the structural problems of Western civilization and the no less critical problems of the Soviet Union are solved. Here we shall consider only the situation in our own society. The third age of expansion of Western civilization began to draw to its close at the end of the 19th century. By 1890 the rate of general expansion had begun to decrease, giving rise to acute crises in industry, agriculture, labor relations, political action, and international relations. These crises culminated in the beginnings of a new, third age of conflict in Western civilization. The third age of conflict of our society began to display the ordinary marks of such a stage about 1890. At that time, in the principal industrial countries, it became clear that the rate of expansion had reversed itself. This led to a frenzied effort by businessmen to organize in cartels and trade as associations in order to keep prices above competitive levels and to share shrinking markets rather than to compete, as formerly, for new ones. Along with this went loud demands for tariff protection and all kinds of restrictive agreements, tacit or explicit, restricting new investment or entry of new enterprises into an activity. Increased pressure was put on governments to favor industrialists, and business organizations were formed to fight labor demands for any larger share of the goods being produced. At the same time, labor and agriculture were reacting in a similar fashion, forming political pressure groups or even political parties, and seeking common action to raise prices, divide markets, exclude foreign competition, and to strike back at organized industry, finance, or transportation. While these activities were occurring as symptoms for the usual decline in the rate of expansion and of the growing class conflicts associated with an age of conflict, the other marks of such a period were no less obvious. Imperialist wars developed from epidemic to endemic status in our culture, beginning perhaps with the Boer War and the Spanish-American War, but rapidly expanding into a cycle of international stress and crises in which we still live. At the same time, on the intellectual level occurred a great absurd thing of irrationality. This latter development is associated with the eager acceptance of the theories of men like Freud, Bergson, or Carroll, and culminated in the utterly irrational activism of Hitler, Mussolini, and many lesser persons. All the characteristics of an age of irrationality began to appear on all sides: increased gambling, increased smoking, the growing use of alcohol and narcotics, a growing obsession with sex and with perversions of sex, an increasing mania for speed, for nervous tension, and for noise, above all, perhaps, the growing tendency to regard violence as a solution for all problems, be they domestic, social, economic, ideological, or international. In fact, violence as a symbol of our growing irrationality has had an increasing role in activity for its own sake, when no possible justification could be made that the activity was seeking to solve the problem. All these characteristics of any age of conflict are too obvious to require further comment. They arose, as is usual in an age of conflict, because the organizational patterns of our culture ceased to function as instruments but had become institutionalized. This process was evident on all levels of culture. Religious organizations no longer linked men to God but adopted diverse mundane purposes. Our intellectual theories no longer explained anything or made us at home in the universe. Our social patterns no longer satisfied our gregarious needs, even when we fled from the lonely anonymity of the city to the rat race uniformity of suburbanism. our political organizations increased the burden of their demands on our time, energy, and wealth, but provided with growing ineffectiveness the justice, public order, education, protection, or incidental amenities we had come to expect from them. And, on the military level, costs rose at an astronomical rate without being able to catch up with our increasing danger. The core of our problems could be placed in any one of the levels we have mentioned. Indeed, there might be good grounds for arguing that the root of our problem was our success in making life an end rather than a means to something higher. But, in this civilization as in others, it will be convenient to discuss the problem of our age of conflict in terms of the institutionalization of our instrument of expansion. In an earlier chapter we discussed this phenomenon as an example of the process in general. Chapter 5. At that time we said that the economic organization had become institutionalized by taking on purposes of its own separate from the purposes of the organization as a whole. The purpose of any economic system is to produce, distribute, and consume goods. If it can do this at an increasing rate within limits, so much the better. Our economic system performed these functions more effectively than any other in history by organizing itself around a profit motivation within a price structure. As it became institutionalized, profits became an end in themselves to the jeopardy of production, distribution, and consumption. The change arose because profits could be maximized only by increasing the margin between selling prices and costs of production. But high selling prices and high profit margins with low costs of production tended to reduce consumption of goods. And low consumption of goods, at a time when production figures were constantly setting new maximum records, could only result in rising inventories and an indigestion of distribution that was bound to make goods back up to the factories to smother production. This situation arose from a number of factors. During the 19th century, production had been emphasized in such a way as to distort the economic system as a whole, since such a system must also include distribution and consumption. Moreover, within the productive system the pursuit of profits had been emphasized to the neglect of any of the other necessary parts of the productive process. Put briefly, profits had become an end rather than a means. One consequence of this failure in coordination of the economic system as a whole, and the even greater failure to coordinate the economic system in the civilization as a whole, had been the growth of a very inequitable distribution of the wealth produced by the economic system. Such an inequitable distribution of wealth was a very excellent thing as long as lack of capital was prevalent in the economic system, but such a maldistribution of income ceases to be an advantage as soon as the productive system has developed out of all proportion to the processes of distribution and of consumption. In the United States, according to the National Industrial Conference Board, the richest one-fifth of our population received 46.2% of the national income in 1910, 51.3% of it in 1929, and 48.5% in 1937. In the same 3 years, the share of the poorest one-fifth of the population fell from 8.3% to 5.4% to 3.6%. Thus the ratios between the portion obtained by the richest one-fifth and that obtained by the poorest one-fifth increased in the 3 years mentioned from 5.6 to 9.3 to 13.5. If, instead of one-fifth, we examine the ratios between the percentage obtained by the richest one-tenth and the poorest one-tenth in the same 3 years, we find that this ratio was 10 in 1910, was 21.7 in 1929, and reached 34.4 in 1937. To some extent this situation was made worse by the growing separation, in the more advanced industrial areas, between ownership and control of corporations, since this led to an increased accumulation of undistributed profits held by the corporations in control of the management rather than distribute as dividends to the owners. Such undistributed profits became savings with no possibility of serving as consumer purchasing power. These factors and a number of others that we have not space to mention here led to a situation where increasing proportions of the national income were going to those persons in the community who would be likely to save, and decreasing proportions were going to those persons in the community who would spend their incomes for consumers' goods. This situation could continue as long as all the savings made by the former group were invested in new capital or otherwise spent, because these actions would distribute such savings to persons who would use their incomes to buy goods. Only under these conditions that all savings be invested or spent could all goods produced be sold. The last statement can be expressed in a simple arithmetical relationship. In any single firm the total selling price of the goods produced is equal to the sum of their costs of production and their profits. In the economic community as a whole, the aggregation of the selling prices of all firms will be the sum of aggregate costs plus aggregate profits. The incomes of the community as a whole are the same as the aggregate of the selling prices of all goods, because the profits and costs of each firm are the incomes of those to whom they are paid. If savings are held back from these incomes, the purchasing power available to purchase the goods being offered for sale will be reduced below the prices being asked. Thus, total prices equals total costs plus profits. Total incomes equals total costs plus profits. Therefore, total prices equals total incomes, but available purchasing power equals incomes, savings plus investment. Accordingly, the purchasing power available to buy the goods being offered at the prices being asked will be inadequate unless all savings are invested. During the World Depression of 1929–38, all savings were not invested because there was no point in spending money on new capital plant so long as the goods being produced by the existing capital plant were going unsold because of the inequitable flow of incomes into the control of persons who wish to save rather than into the control of those who wish to consume. This crisis of the system was intensified by a number of other factors, notably the deflationary influence of the bone monetary system tied to a limited supply of gold under conditions of power production of goods. As a consequence, the crisis was accompanied by a drastic price deflation that eventually led to a banking crisis and the end of the international gold standard. The date of this last event could be fixed at September 21, 1931, when sterling, which had been the center of the whole world's financial network for more than a century, went off gold. Succinctly, the banking crisis arose when prices of goods fell so low that the banks could not liquidate collateral fast enough and at high enough prices to provide sufficient funds to meet the demands made on their reserves. As confidence in the banking system decreased, demands rose, reserves fell, and the liquidation of collateral could not keep up with either. Accordingly, banks could not fulfill their obligations and had to close their doors, go bankrupt, or call upon governments for help. The net result was the end of financial capitalism. This shift from financial capitalism to monopoly capitalism was made possible by the very means that bankers developed for their control of business firms. As we have seen, business firms came to bankers to obtain capital and were bound to remain under banking influence as long as their need for outside capital continued. To ensure continued banking control of these firms, bankers used such mechanisms as interlocking directorships, holding companies, consolidations, and controlled banking services. But these methods of banking control, by reducing competition between firms, made it possible to seek profits by raising prices rather than by decreasing costs, and thus made it possible for such firms to become self-financing of their own capital needs and, accordingly, to be freed from banking control. In the earlier period, the firm could not seek profits by raising prices because both competition with other firms and the limited supply of money anchored to the limited supply of gold made it difficult to raise prices of any individual product. Accordingly, profits, which are the margin between prices and cost, had to be sought by reducing costs. This need, incidentally, placed the interest of labor in opposition to management, since wages formed the chief item in costs. Management thus, in the periods of industrial capitalism and in the following period of financial capitalism, was almost inevitably opposed to the unionization of labor. But once financial capitalism had brought considerable elements of monopoly into the picture, as J.P. Morgan did when he organized the United States Steel Corporation, decreased competition made it possible to increase profits by raising prices faster than costs. This made it possible for firms to become self-financing out of their own profits, to dispense with bankers' flotations and biased advice, and to reduce management's opposition to unionization of labor. As industry became more heavily capitalized, wages became a decreasing portion of costs, and the value of uninterrupted use of the expensive capital plant made it advisable to avoid labor disputes and labor stoppages by allowing unionization of labor and higher wages, recovering the increased costs of higher wages by raising the increasingly non-competitive prices of the products Thus highly capitalized monopolistic industry became an exploitation of the absent consumer by management and labor jointly. At approximately the same time, the end of the international gold standard freed the supply of money from its dependence on the limited supply of gold and from the maldistribution of gold arising from the bankers' mismanagement of the gold standard, and thus made it possible for prices to be raised, perhaps indefinitely, by joint labor management actions. And finally, in the same context of events, the pressure to raise wages was increased by the desire to provide increased purchasing power to buy the growing flood of goods being produced. The shift from financial capitalism to monopoly capitalism made possible a new period of expansion in Western civilization. But before that new mechanism could be used for expansive purposes, the institutionalization of the previous, thus organization of financial capitalism, had thrown the whole society into an age of conflict. It is not yet clear if the society will be destroyed as a consequence of this, or if it will be able to straighten itself on a new course of expansion. The structure of the new system is entirely different from that which existed in the period of financial capitalism before 1929. In that earlier period, the two chief differences were: one, that the whole economic system was dominated by bankers and financiers, especially by investment bankers, and two, that, as a result, the system had a financial mechanism that was basically deflationary because the volume of money was determined, in the final analysis, by the limited supply of gold. As a consequence of the first of these characteristics, the lines of prestige and influence in the system passed from financiers to heavy industry and then to light industry and commerce, after which they were diffused among petty bourgeois clerks, farmers, laborers, bureaucrats, and service workers. As a consequence of the World Depression, finance was reduced to a subordinate role, and a struggle arose about the arrangement of the other groups. In fascist states, industry, commerce, and petty bourgeois, by abolishing any forms of political democracy, sought to establish authoritarian regimes in which industry with its allies could exploit farmers, laborers, and consumers in general in order to favor producers in general. In New Deal and democratic states this did not occur, but instead labor, farmers, commercial groups, and to some extent consumers in general were strengthened, and all groups including reduced finance became satellites around the governmental system. The control of money supply, which had been one of the chief attributes of the banking group before 1929, became an attribute of the government after 1945, and the government exercised its control under pressure from the shifting alliances and alignments of the great economic power blocks that surrounded it. These blocks came to include 1. Finance, 2. Heavy industry, 3. Light industry, 4. Commercial and service groups such as real estate, 5. Civil servants, 6. The armed services, 7. Labor, 8. Farmers, 9. Transportation, and others. If any one or several of these blocks become too obviously exploitative of the others, The others form an alignment to pressurize the government in another direction. The chief consequence of such alignments and pressures has been to increase government spending and thus to increase inflation. In general, all these pressures have sought to achieve some redistribution of economic resources among the three chief claimants to these resources. These three are consumption, capital accumulation, and government services including defense. In the financial capitalist system before 1929, the great danger had been the great diversion of resources toward capital accumulation to the jeopardy of the two others. In the new pluralistic system that had arisen, the great danger in many countries has been toward increasing consumption to the jeopardy of capital accumulation and public service. This danger has frequently appeared as a tendency toward inflation that would destroy capital accumulation by destroying savings. At the present time it is too early to judge if the present crisis of Western civilization will resolve itself into a new, fourth age of expansion, or will continue through an age of conflict to a universal empire and ultimately to decay and invasion. In any case, the immediate future seems to offer to Western society a culture in which, on various levels, an army of specialists serves an ideological state, supported by a pluralist economy regulated by planning both public and private in a society in which the dominant social class is made up of managers rather than owners, bankers, voters, or others. In this culture, the nature of the intellectual and religious levels will depend on whether the whole system continues in a period of conflict or turns toward a new age of expansion.